Chapter 3 of Part 1 of the Lives of the Three Misses Judsons, by Arabella M. Wilson. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3. Her arrival in Calcutta, difficulties with the Bengal government, voyage to the Isle of France, death of Mrs. Newell, change of sentiments, voyage to Rangoon. Mr. and Mrs. Judson landed at Calcutta on the 18th of June, 1812, and were hospitably received by the venerable Dr. Carey, who immediately conducted them to his home in Serampore. There they found a delightful mission family, consisting of Messrs. Carey, Marshman, and Ward, with their wives and children, who welcomed them most cordially, and invited them to remain until the arrival of their brother missionaries. Of the arrangements in this truly Christian family, the schools, the religious exercises, the cultivation of the gardens belonging to the establishment, and the instruction communicated to the natives, they express themselves in the highest terms of eulogy. Hitherto the course of our missionaries in their enterprise had indeed run smooth, and they had begun to flatter themselves that they had overestimated the trials and dangers of the life they had chosen. But sad reverses awaited them. They had been in Serampore but 10 days when Messrs. Judson and Newell were summoned to Calcutta, where an order from government was read to them, commanding them immediately to leave the country and return to America. The British East India Company were at that time unfriendly to missions, and especially intolerant to missionaries from America. The idea of returning without effecting the object for which they had left their native land was too painful to be endured by the missionaries, and they immediately attempted to gain permission to go to some country not under the company's jurisdiction. Burma, the field to which they had been assigned by their brethren at home, seemed, for various reasons, utterly inaccessible, but they finally got leave to take passage in a ship bound for the Isle of France. The vessel would, however, accommodate but 2 passengers, and the health of Mrs. Newell requiring that she should be in a place of quiet, it was agreed that she and her husband should embark in it. For 3 months the rest of the company remained in Calcutta, watched with jealousy by the British government, but unable to find a vessel to convey them away. At length they had peremptory orders to embark in a vessel bound to England. All hope of escape seemed now cut off, when Mr. Judson accidentally learned that a ship was about sailing for the Isle of France. They applied for a passport to go on board of her, but were refused. They informed the captain of the vessel of their circumstances, and were allowed to go on board without a pass. They had gone but a few miles down the river, however, when a government dispatch overtook them, commanding the pilot to conduct the ship no further, as there were persons on board who had been ordered to England. By advice of the captain, the missionaries left the ship and went on shore, while the pilot wrote a certificate that no such persons were on board. The captain, being angry at the detention of his vessel, ordered them to take their baggage from it immediately, but at length consented to let it remain on board until he should reach a tavern 16 miles further down the river. Mrs. Judson also remained in the ship until it came opposite the tavern, where, she says, the pilot kindly lent me his boat and a servant to go on shore. I immediately procured a large boat to send to the ship for our baggage. I entered the tavern, a stranger, a female, and unprotected. I called for a room and sat down to reflect on my disconsolate situation. I had nothing with me but a few rupees. I did not know that the boat which I had sent after the vessel would overtake it, and if it did, whether it would ever return with our baggage. Neither did I know where Mr. Judson was, or when he would come, or with what treatment I should meet at the tavern. I thought of home, and said to myself, these are some of the trials attendant upon a missionary life, and which I have anticipated. In a few hours Mr. J. arrived, and toward night our baggage. After 2 or 3 days of great perplexity and distress, and when they had given up all hope of being able to proceed to the Isle of France, they unexpectedly received from an unknown friend a magistrate's pass to go on board the Creole, the vessel they had left. Their only difficulty now was that she had probably got out to sea, as it was 3 days since they had left her. However, they hastened down the river 70 miles to Saugur, where, among many ships at anchor, they had the inexpressible happiness to find the Creole, on which they embarked for the Isle of France, their first destination. Their dangers on the passage to the Isle of France were great, the vessel being old and leaky, and when they reached there they found little encouragement to remain. While on the island, Mrs. J. had a severe attack of illness, as well as much depression of spirits from the uncertainties of their situation. After much deliberation they determined to establish themselves on an island near Malacca, to reach which they must first go to Madras, and they accordingly sailed for that place. War having broken out between England and America, the hostility of the East India Directors to American missionaries was of course much increased, so that it would be impossible for them to make any stop at all in Madras, without incurring the danger of being sent back to America. What, then, was their distress on their arrival there, to find no ship bound for the island they wished to visit. Their way seemed entirely hedged up, for the only vessel in Madras harbor ready for the sea was destined to Burma, a country pronounced by all their friends in India utterly inaccessible. In her journal at this time Mrs. J. writes, "O our Heavenly Father, direct us aught. Where wilt thou have us go? What wilt thou have us do? Our only hope is in thee, and to thee only do we look for protection. Oh, let this mission live before thee. Tomorrow," she adds, at a somewhat later date, "we expect to embark for Rangoon, in Burma. Adieu to polished, refined Christian society. Our lot is not cast among you, but among pagans, among barbarians, whose tender mercies are cruel. Indeed, we voluntarily forsake you, and for Jesus' sake choose the latter for our associates. Oh, may we be prepared for the pure and polished society of heaven, composed of the followers of the Lamb, whose robes have been washed in his blood." Everything combined to render the passage to Rangoon unpleasant and perilous. Sickness, threatened shipwreck, and the want of all comforts. But at length, on the 14th of July, 1813, about 18 months from the time they left Salem, in Massachusetts, they set their weary wandering feet on that shore which was to be their future home. Among the depressing circumstances that had occurred in this gloomy period, not the least painful was the death of Mrs. Judson's early friend and companion in her eastern voyage, Mrs. Harriet Newell. Of less mental and physical vigor than Mrs. Judson, this amiable and ardent Christian had gladly relinquished all her objects in life, for that of sharing the privations and soothing the cares of a husband to whom she was tenderly attached, in his labors among the heathen. But this privilege was denied her. She was not even permitted to reach a scene of missionary labor. Her heartbroken husband was compelled to bury her in a far distant isle of the ocean, and finish his short earthly course alone. But he lived to see the grave that young martyr missionary visited by many pilgrim feet, and her name embalmed in many admiring hearts. How keenly Mrs. Judson felt her loss may be learned from a letter written from the Isle of France, whither she and her husband went on being driven from Calcutta. "Have at last arrived in port, but oh, what news! What distressing news! Harriet is dead! Harriet, my dear friend, my earliest associate in the mission, is no more. Oh, death! Could not this wide world afford 3 victims enough? But thou must enter the family of a solitary few, whose comfort and happiness depended so much on the society of each other. Could not this infant mission be shielded from thy shafts? But be still, my heart, and know that God has done it. Just and true are thy ways, O thou King of saints." Another heavy trial was the separation of herself and husband from the church in which they were both educated, from the missionary association on which they depended for support, and from the sympathies of those Christians in their native land who had hitherto given them the most cordial encouragement in their enterprise. This separation was in consequence of a change in their sentiments in regard to baptism. So liberal has the church become at this day, that all now look upon this change as having decidedly advanced the cause of missions by enlisting a large and respectable body of Christians in this country, not hitherto engaged in it. But in 1813 a step like this on the part of beneficiaries of the board could not but be regarded with much disfavor and prejudice, render those who had taken it highly unpopular, and even subject their motives to unworthy imputations. Whatever may be thought of the soundness of their new views, therefore, there is not the shadow of reason to doubt their conscientiousness in adopting them. That they did in the face of every worldly motive, their letters and journals abundantly prove. Mrs. Judson writes: "It is extremely trying to reflect on the consequences of our becoming Baptists. We must make some very painful sacrifices. We must be separated from our dear missionary associates, and labor alone in some isolated spot. We must expect to be treated with contempt, and to be cast off by many of our American friends, forfeit the character we have in our native land, and probably have to labor for our own support wherever we are stationed. These things are very trying to us, and cause our hearts to bleed for anguish. We feel that we have no home in this world, and no friend but each other. A renunciation of our former sentiments has caused us more pain than anything which ever happened to us through our lives." Thus perplexed, but not in despair, cast down but not destroyed, they reached Rangoon, then the capital of the Burman Empire, and established themselves in what they regarded as their future home. Here, remote, unfriended, and solitary, reft of every stay but heaven, they were destined to pass nearly 2 years before their hearts could be cheered by the intelligence from America of the general interest awakened for them there in the denomination with which they had connected themselves, and the formation of a Baptist Board of Missions which had appointed them its missionaries. Of one thing, however, they must have felt sure, that they were conducted there by the special providence of God. "The honor of commencing the Burman mission," says Professor Gamel, "is to be ascribed rather to the divine head of the church, than to any leading movement or agency of the Baptist denomination. The way was prepared, and the field was opened by God alone, and it only remained for true hearted laborers to enter in and prosecute the noble work to which they had been summoned." Chapter 4